Pornography, you have there is a tendency, it's very difficult not to focus on the out of the ordinary things, when you should maybe just focus on the ordinary, the common, the porn that is like the majority of the porn, well, the vaginal intercourses, basically. Whereas you have a tendency to, get caught up with the anal penetrations and the spanking and the hitting and the strangling and, but all of those things are very marginal. So I really kind of controlled myself not to write too much about that in my book, but I've always wanted an opportunity to be able to speak about these things. And this was the perfect opportunity. So this paper is about what was censored and what was cut out of the porn films in Sweden in the 1970s. In 1911, Sweden implemented a state film censorship institution, Statens Biografbyrå, or the National Board of Film Censors, or actually the State Bureau of Cinemas. The Cinema Ordinance, an exception from Sweden's freedom of expression and freedom of the press, regulated the censorship of moving images. The objective of this exception to the constitutional freedoms of expression and the press was that moving images were perceived as harmful, in particular to a young audience. The National Board of Film Censors was thus given the prerogative to review all films intended for public screening, that is, for theatrical release in some form, prior to release in Sweden, and provide them with an age limit. In the beginning, the only age limit was 15. But in the 1960s, an age limit of 11 was added. And in the 1970s, one of 7. In addition, the National Board of Film Censors could prohibit a film from public screening. For this presentation, however, more significant is the fact that they could also elect to cut scenes or parts of scenes from a film in order to render it less harmful. The most famous case, and also the last time the board cut a non-pornographic film, is when Martin Scorsese's Casino from 1995 was subjected to 3 cuts. 1, torture in vice, and 2, abuse with bat, which led to a prolonged process of appeals before the film finally was released in 1996 with the cuts and with a disclaimer by Scorsese that was shown before the film started. In 2011, the National Board of Film Censors was replaced by the State's Media Council, which provides age limits for films and censorship for films aimed at an audience over 15 ended. Pornography, on the other hand, was regulated through the Swedish Penal Code and the paragraph that forbade obscene materials. In 1971, pornography was decriminalized. Previously, very few pornographic films had been submitted for review by the board, since they were already forbidden. Although the practice of the film censorship had become quite liberalized regarding sexually explicit material in the 1960s, after controversial censorship decisions such as Ingmar Bergman's The Silence in 1963 and Vilgot Sjömans 491 in 1964. Even though this more liberal view was held, submitting a hardcore pornographic film for review was basically to admit to illegal activity. After 1971, the number of submissions of hardcore pornographic films to the National Board of Film Censors increased massively. The board had to review these films, provide them with an age limit, usually 15, and if they were deemed harmfully exciting or brutalizing, they would be subjected to cuts or even prohibited. Harmfully exciting and brutalizing was usually understood as violence. The connection between the affects of arousal and aggression seemed to carry with them a potential for harmfulness that superseded that of most other genres. This means that things that might pass in a non-pornographic mainstream film, such as a man being punched in the face or scenes from a bullfighting, or the presence of a gun or a knife, would be regarded as harmfully exciting in the context of a pornographic film. According to a study by Swedish film scholar Elisabeth Björklund of the board's practices in the late 1960s, before the removal of the obscenity clause, the board was more skeptical to films that transgressed the boundaries of normative sexuality. Consequently, in the years before pornography was legalized, sexually explicit material, excluding the hardcore material, was more likely to be censored if it, for instance, showed lesbian sexuality in a way that was threatening to dominant heteronormativity. Anything outside of heterosexual vaginal intercourse between reasonably aged partners that were in some kind of relationship was thereby in a gray zone which might be subjected to the censor's cutting or even the prohibition of the entire film. Quite obviously, Game Rubin's sexual hierarchies come to mind, and pointing to the use of the word pathological in some records of the board's work, Björklund argues that one can detect a kind of sexuality that was, quote, officially understood as the right one, end of quote, in the records of the board. In a different study, I have looked closer at the censorship decisions regarding 2 pornographic 8mm films which depicted rape, and found indications that gender expectations influenced the decisions of the board. That social norms concerning gender and sexuality have implications for how films are treated is perhaps not so surprising. However, the Rubin hierarchy seems to have been more relevant in the years immediately preceding the legalization of pornography, since the board's jurisdiction in matters concerning sexually explicit material later became curtailed. They could no longer refer to, quote, discipline and virtue, end of quote, which was the wording of the obscenity clause, to agree to their own instructions about material that could be harmfully exciting or brutalizing. Nonetheless, it might be interesting to look closer at the sexual practices which were cut out by the board, the ones that were deemed harmful. After 1971, this was, as I mentioned previously, most often sex in combination with violence. According to a theater operator who worked at the National Board of Film Censors, all pornographic films were screened at double speed. As soon as the censor reviewing the film saw a gun, a whip, or something else associated with violence, the censor would ask the operator to slow down and take notes on what must be cut. This story is, of course, anecdotal and has not been confirmed. Nonetheless, it would account for some strange inconsistencies, like what might look like rape is cut in one film but not in another one. The anecdote also illustrates quite neatly how literally violence was understood. For instance, vaginal penetration was not understood as a violent act, and neither were there any conceptions about structural violence or psychological violence. In the eyes of the censors, even in combination with sex, violence could always easily be recognized, contained, and eliminated. Films that were completely prohibited were sent back to the submitters. Consequently, the only records that remain of those are the censorship acts, one registration card and one censorship card, on which a brief description of the film and a motivation to the decision is printed. The cuts that were made, however, were from the 1930s and on, saved and archived in the board's own archive. This is a paradoxical collection of leftovers, the potato peels of the pornographic dish that was ultimately served the audience. And this paradox has been the subject of an art installation. In 2009, shortly before the end of Swedish film censorship, the artist Marcus Örn created a 49 hours long film consisting of all censored clips from 1934 to 1997. Örn's compilation film, Magic Bullet, contains clips from animated films like Donald Duck cartoons, clips of violence and action, and clips of sex, and clips of sex in combination with violence in an absurd marathon of all the things that had been considered dangerous and forbidden. In this presentation, however, I will focus on 42 clips that are in a separate collection of the archive, and these are the cuts that are made from 8mm pornographic films, and since 2011 archived at the National Archive in Stockholm. That there are only 42 clips is a bit confounding, since more than 2,500 pornographic 8mm films were submitted to the board during this time, and there are records of more films that were cut. However, first of all, considering the sometimes sloppy handling of pornographic films by the board, mistakes may have been made while saving the cuts, and also considering the state the clips were in, some may have been broken beyond repair and discarded. Secondly, it also says something about the vast majority of the porn submitted to the board and the board's literal interpretation of violence. The vast majority of the porn films submitted were not particularly violent, but showed sexual intercourse and masturbation. The number of prohibited films was quite low as well. These 42 clips thus constitute an archive of that which was rejected by a governmental agency and deemed too harmful or potentially brutalizing for a Swedish audience. In all fairness, I think that the conception was that these were too harmful for any audience, but of course they couldn't censor films outside of Sweden. In the title of this paper, I have called this an archive of intervention, because that is, in a sense, what this is. These are the leftovers of the board's intervention, as if they had saved the potato peels or cores of apples or eggshells. The clips have also, in a way, been treated as leftovers, because even though they are numbered and archived, they have not been preserved with any particular care. So watching them entails a constant apprehension that the crackling strip of film will at any moment tear or even disintegrate before your eyes. I should also add that in most cases I have not seen the films from which these cuts were cut. Some of the films I have seen, like the Lasse Brown films and the Swedish film called The Sadists, which was in an uncut shape found in the Kinsey Institute archive, but most of the films I have not seen, apart from what was cut out from them. As usual, the Lasse Brown films stand out because no less than 7 of these 42 clips are from Lasse Brown films, which makes up 1/6 of the archive of intervention, which is not proportionate in relation to his output. Of the 42 clips, 1 is gay, or from a gay film, and the remaining 41 are straight. I have loosely categorized the sexual activities in the clips under 6 headings: penetration, by which I mean anal, double, or oral; whipping or spanking, that is hitting someone with an instrument made expressly for such a purpose; bondage, someone is tied up, and that could be with chains, with silk ribbons, or rope; rape scenarios, usually a man being overpowered or forced at gunpoint to have sex with one or several men; weapons, guns and knives, usually not used for sex, but for coercion, threatening, and or killing. And then one miscellaneous category under which 7 quite different clips have been including. An intense BDSM scene with labia clamps and costumes and a giant dildo. One scene with dogs that were not involved in intercourse, they were just kind of running around, but the presence of dogs is of course very harmful and dangerous. 2 that contain urination, brief shots of gaping female genitalia, one with hair pulling during fellatio, and one which is not sexual but is a man punched in the face. As you probably guess, these categories are very crude and some clips fall under more than one heading, but they are not the point of this presentation, only a way to try to describe them. Some observations can be made. The censored penetrations are from the first years of legalized pornography, except for one in which a woman is forced to fellatio as one among several coercive sex acts, and another one where anal sex is part of a BDSM scenario. The rape scenarios are by far the most plentiful. 16 clips fall under this category, and 15 of these are male on female rape, and what must be remembered with these clips is that they usually, although not always, eliminate the beginning of the film, in which the woman is overpowered. This means that films that originally were constructed as a kind of rape porn were screened as consensual sex acts, because what the censors cut out is part of the film in which the woman resists and struggles, and what was allowed was the part of the intercourse in which the woman has succumbed and begun to enjoy the sex. Films in which the woman at no point turned acquiescent were prohibited in their entirety, like the Danish films Rosa and the Men and Violated in the Forest, both submitted to the board in 1972. The second most common category is whipping or spanking, with 8 clips, among them the only censored scene from a gay film, Homo Story from 1975. The clip contains 2 men that are having sex and the woman who is whipping them until they, kind of get up and take the whip from her. 5 clips fall under the category weapons, and there are 2 subgroups here. One in which the weapons are not part of the sex act, but used as part of the narrative, like in a spy story. So, for instance, in Bloody Malaga or Orgy in Rome. In Bloody Malaga, they have also taken out shots from a bullfighting that are intersected with intercourse. So, as I mentioned earlier, sex and violence in combination does not necessarily have to mean violent sex or sexual violence, but any combination of sex and violence seems to have been deemed problematic and potentially harmful. In the other subgroup, weapons are used to coerce someone into undressing and sex. These clips are also included in the rape scenario category. In one case, Great Lover Never Dies, a woman threatens two men with a rifle, forces them to undress, and then masturbates one of them while she's holding the rifle to his throat. And then they lie down on the bed and start to have sex, and she puts the gun away, and that's where the censored clip ends. Normative expectations around gender and sexuality continued to play a role in the board's work after the legalization of pornography, although to a less obvious degree than in the late 1960s. For instance, although homosexuality was classified as a mental illness in Sweden until 1979, there is only one gay clip in the collection, and it's censored not with any reference to possibly harmful influence, but due to the occurrence of whipping. Nonetheless, there are in particular two observations that I would like to make. The first one has to do with the perception of the combination of aggression, violence, and arousal sex as harmful, together with a very literal understanding of violence. By the sheer context of a pornographic film, violence became more harmful than it was deemed in mainstream non-pornographic films. The low status of the genre obviously played into these decisions. Low-budget films in general were usually treated more harshly by the board, whereas recognized art cinema fared better. As a comparison, Pasolini's Salò from 1975 was released with no cuts in 1976. Although the board was not supposed to take taste and aesthetics into account, they still did. However, there is also a long-standing common-sense perception that sexual arousal and aggression are connected and may reinforce one another, which is reflected in studies made today on, for example, video game players. This notion is further emphasized by a sense that these violent elements are meaningless, without any higher purpose than to entice, arouse, and awaken brute animal instincts in the spectator. The second observation has to do with the understanding of BDSM as a sexual practice, which, although still marked by prejudice in a general consciousness, has become much more accepted than in the 1960s or 1970s. Its presence in the universe of Stieg Larsson's Millennium series bear testimony to a radical change. The focus on the keywords safe, sane, and consensual almost seem to make BDSM the sexual practice par préférence in the queer feminist sexual utopia that Stieg Larsson imagines. According to sociologist Laura Zambelli, BDSM entered a process of normalization in the 1970s, a process which is in no way completed, but in 2009, the Swedish National Board of Health and Welfare ceased classifying BDSM as a mental illness. In the 1960s and 1970s, the acronym BDSM was not yet in existence, and sexual sadism was regarded as a pathological condition. When considering these clips, I initially made an assumption in that I regarded the scenes in which bondage, whipping, and/or spanking occurred as BDSM scenes when they were clearly staged as such, in a theatrical setting with costumes and paraphernalia. And although consent is a significant, maybe even the significant component of BDSM, another vital ingredient is that in the act of BDSM, consent should not be explicit. But for me, watching these theatrical clips, I kind of took that consent for granted because of the particular stage character. And I separated these clips from the more realistically enacted rape scenarios with my 21st century presumption that BDSM is not violence. However, I eventually came to a point where I realized that such a differentiation is actually problematic, since the realist scenarios within the context of production, too, were staged and directed. And as we know, it is next to impossible to judge whether a person really is consenting from the images we see. In a way, by focusing on this literal interpretation of violence, the board took the easy way out. Of course, as a film scholar, I would prefer that there was no film censorship, and I find their cuttings crude and unnuanced. But faced with the task of censoring 2,500 pornographic 8mm films, well, this is as good as any way, I think, or not. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, for this.